Good afternoon. I'm sorry I don't speak Serbian, so it will have to be in English. There's no translation, so...
No, we couldn't really manage to provide for translation, so the panel will be in English.
Anyway, things will be up on the board, so you can take your time reading them. First of all, I'd like to thank the Center for the Politics of Emancipation for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about my dear subject, the shock therapy of Greece, which in fact we shall put in a framework of neoliberalism and social justice. This is an outline of the areas we shall be touching on. It is a long list of things, of issues. Don't take fright. Some of these I shall go through quite quickly. Some of these we shall take a little longer, and hopefully I shall finish on time. So we shall explore briefly the concept of social justice, the neoliberal state, how the two come together, and how the two have evolved in more recent times. We shall then turn to the EU and look at the concept and measurement of the social justice in the EU. We will then discuss in some detail the case of Greece. Starting with the concept of social justice. Conceptually, this is a relational concept. That is, it reflects the balance of material forces subject to the logics of market, capitalism on the one hand, and justice or democracy on the other hand, if you'd like to bring those together, those concepts together. So it's a relational concept as a term. It is relatively new in Western thought. It emerged in the during the time of the Industrial Revolution and the capitalist exploitation of labor, it was a rallying cry in the mid-1800 revolutions across Europe. The UN uses the concept to refer to the language of rights, equality, equity, inequality, so as to make it more tangible, to make it more manageable, to give it greater substance. The preamble to the ILO Constitution refers to the fact that universal and lasting peace can only be established if it is based on social justice. So it's an interesting concept. You come across it in various in different frameworks, and so it's worth looking into in greater detail. The neoliberal state, on the other hand, well, two approaches to the neoliberal state: the theoretical approach and the practical approach. We said social justice is a relational concept. So, in other words, it requires a framework within which relations between individuals, between groups are understood and assessed. Nowadays, this is the nation state. So, what is the neoliberal state in theory? In theory, the neoliberal state is in favor of individual property rights, of the rule of law, of institutions of free markets and free trade. When it comes to poverty and inequality, these are expected to be handled through the trickle-down effect of free markets and free trade. So as the pie gets bigger, the poor get a small piece of it. In practice, however, neoliberalism is full of tensions, whereas it is the competition is supposed to be perfect. In fact, what you have is monopoly or oligopoly. The market doesn't always work, market failures. Information and power are asymmetrically distributed. Technological advancement can destabilize the system of relations. So you have various kinds of tensions within capitalism and within neoliberalism. So what we end up is a government that tries to intervene to deal with these tensions by elites and experts who believe, or are supposed to believe, that the state should not intervene. So this is what you might call a paradox. On the one hand, you have intense state interventions and government. On the other hand, you have this theoretical construct of non-intervention. If we bring the two together now, we end up with neoliberal state and social justice as two antagonistic concepts, two antagonistic ideas. The neoliberal state seeks first and foremost to privatize public services and assets. When it comes to public services, it places the emphasis on individual responsibility. It's your responsibility to get education. It's your responsibility to find the best doctor and pay for it, to secure means of living after you have retired, and so on. Furthermore, the neoliberal state wants flexible, unprotected labor relations, that is the free market, labor market, which of course results in precarious types of employment, rising unemployment, low wages. So the three ideas, the triptych, as I would call it, privatization, deregulation, and competition, in the name of greater efficiency and productivity, better quality of production, and lower costs. This is the overarching principle of neoliberalism: privatization, deregulation, competition. This requires a radical reconfiguration of state institutions and practices, which leads to an intensification of bipolarities. Coercion on the one hand, consent on the other. This is a tension, and it becomes intensified under state of neoliberalism. Capital on the one hand, popular movements on the other. Executive judicial powers on the one hand, representative democracy on the other. So what you see is what Gramsci talked about as a unity of political and civil society is in fact giving way to the intensification of oppositional forces fighting against each other. It is under these conditions that social justice becomes politicized. It's not just a term, it's a political cry, and antagonistic. This is a nice graph. It comes from a paper by Thomas Paley, and it shows how workers are squeezed out in a neoliberal box. You have the abandonment of full employment. It is no longer important. You don't need full employment. You have labor market flexibility instead of full employment. You have small government with the paradox that I mentioned just a minute ago, and you have, of course, globalization, global markets, financialization, finance becoming dominant. Now, we move on to authoritarian neoliberalism. This is a further stage of neoliberalism. Inbuilt tensions and contradictions in neoliberalism leads to periodic financial and economic crisis. This is a fact. It's historically recorded. Now, neoliberalism, by its very nature, is deeply suspicious of democracy, because democracy means that individual rights are threatened. They may have to be circumscribed. At a time of crisis, authoritarian neoliberalism takes over. In other words, the dominant social groups, and this comes from Ian Bruff's paper, the excerpt here, dominant social groups are less interested in neutralizing resistance and dissent via concessions and forms of compromise that maintain their hegemony, favoring instead the explicit exclusion and marginalization of dissenting groups. In other words, if you're a dissenter, the system throws you out. They don't try to draw you in, to buy you in. They prefer to throw you out because you're too dangerous for the system. So what you end up with is yet another tension, a growing tension between the state's function of domination which is the organizing the hegemony of the power block, of the dominant interests, and representation. Representation is the other function of the state, that is, legitimizing the regime by means of popular democratic forms. So you have a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of democracy, and the bipolarities we talked of just a little while ago are intensified. So this is a general conceptual framework I've tried to set up. What about the EU? Where do we stand with the EU? Well, the EU is not a nation state. The EU is something in between an interstate and an intrastate. It is a particular type of polity. You have multi-level system of governance, which approximates a confederation. It is executive dominated. Since the onset of the neoliberal agenda, which is going back to the 80s and 90s, in the EU, norms and institutions have increasingly penetrated the national level in correspondence with the needs of capital, especially financial capital. On the other hand, while the market logic and capital have become rapidly supranationalized, crossed over borders, social justice and democracy are still viewed within the national borders, within the state, the national state. In other words, the EU, the European Union, lacks the channels of contestation, of making it possible to legitimize redistribution. It's a matter for the nation state, which is, however, subjected to overall economic rules and priorities. So that's how you end up with a social justice deficit. On the one hand, you have economic and financial integration, plus the subordination of social issues and policy to economic priorities. And on the other hand, you have a deepening deficit, especially due to the crisis and the response of the EU to the crisis. Habermas has called, and of course he is a very Eurocentric analyst, he has called the EU a technocracy without democratic roots, quite clearly. Nancy Fraser is more explicit. She says the construction of Europe as an economic and monetary union without corresponding political and fiscal integration disabled the protective capacities of member states without creating broader Europe-wide equivalents to take up the slack. So you end up with Greece being a protectorate nowadays, Spain, Portugal, Ireland ruled from Brussels. Central bankers set limits to domestic policy even in Germany and France. The upshot, the result, is that the project of social protection can no longer be envisioned in the national frame. So the national frame has become superfluous, but there's nothing to replace it. That is the tragedy today. Okay, this is what we need to note here is that there is what is called social justice index. This is an attempt by the Bertelsmann Foundation to measure, to provide a measurement of social justice and its deficit in terms of 6 components. You have the 6 components there, the top blue boxes, that is poverty prevention, equitable education, labor market access, social cohesion and non-discrimination, health, intergenerational justice. Of the 6 components, the first 3, poverty prevention, equitable education and labor market access, are given additional weight, are more important than the other 3. So they have been measuring the social justice deficit across Europe, and they end up with this graph, and you can see the 28 member states there, and on a number of years, 2008, 11, 14, and 15. The light blue line is the EU average, and you see that above the EU average are the old, if you would like to call them that, mainly the old EU 15, and below is, you find the Southern European and Central European, mostly, states. Greece is right down at the bottom, the last one. This is a graph, comes from the Bertelsmann Foundation findings, and it shows a correlation. The higher income per head, the more likely it is that you have a higher social justice index. So, Conversely, the lower your GDP per capita, the more likely to have a big deficit, to have a problem when it comes to social justice. Overall, what we notice, what we observe in the graph that I showed you is that between 2008 and 2015, only 5 member states out of the 28 improved the social justice index. There is a large and persistent gap between Northern and Southern Europe. If we go back there, you can see that Sweden, Denmark, and Finland are consistently at the top of the scale across since 2008 to 2015. So you have a large and persistent gap between Northern and Southern Europe. Northern countries suffered a drop but still are at the top of the scale. The largest decline was recorded for the peripheral countries, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece. There is a correlation, as I showed you just a minute ago, and Greece is right at the bottom, with the greatest decline between 2008 and 2015. Okay, so Greece and its shock therapy. We have had 3 so-called economic adjustment programs. 148.2 billion have been disbursed, given out to the Greek governments. I noted there that more than 85% of that amount has been given to the banks. In fact, I was wrong. It's more than 95%. I didn't have the time to correct my slide. This paper by the European School of Management and Technology, which is based in Berlin, came out just yesterday. I received it after I had sent out my presentation, and they have made very detailed measurements and found that just under 5% has actually gone to the Greek people of the 248.2 billion, which 248.2 billion is part of the public debt. We owe it right now. Now, this large amount of money was given on very strict conditions of austerity, deregulation, privatization. Remember, we said the triptych of neoliberalism? Well, here it is: austerity, deregulation, privatization. The latest loan that was given last summer, consists of 86 billion. And in fact, here I have made a mistake because it's 63% goes to debt service, that is the creditors. 29% goes to the Greek banks. And in fact, it's only 8% that goes to the budget. My mistake is that the total is not 86, but it is 94 when the proceeds, the expected proceeds from privatization are included in that figure. So where it says 17%, it should say 8%. And of course, we have further conditions of fiscal consolidation, that is austerity, recapitalization of the Greek banks, what they call institutional and structural reforms is deregulation, privatization. The targets, primary surplus in over GDP targets, minus 0.25% of GDP last year. We made that, plus a surplus this year, primary in the sense that it does not include the interest paid on the debt. 1.75 2017 next year, and the last year 3.5%. Anything more than that goes to the debt service again, to the creditors, although 30% is kept for the budget. Now, as of on this last loan that was given to Greece, there is a separate paper produced by the European Commission, the Social Impact Assessment. What they did is, because of the horrible way the whole exercise has been going since 2010, when the first loan was given out, this time they felt that they should really legitimize the whole thing by producing a social impact assessment of the new loan. So the conclusion of the assessment of the European Commission is that if you do exactly as we say, you'll be okay. Full implementation of the ambitious structural reforms, remember structural reforms are deregulation, privatization, will strengthen potential GDP growth, reduce prices of goods and services, foster competitiveness, create employment opportunities. You see, this is the neoliberal dogma. You do this through supply side, through intervening, through taking measures that affect the supply side. Nothing to do with demand, nothing to do with boosting demand, incomes, employment, and so on. And these are the results of the shock therapy. The red line in all these graphs is Greece. And you can see the huge jump up and then down, collapsing. Consumption and investment. Demand, that is. Okay? Consumption, public and private, investment, public and private. I've put up the 4 southern European countries because it is interesting. The trends are fairly common across the 4 countries. Greece is the worst case. Italy and Spain are somewhere in the middle. Portugal is not very far from Greece, but Greece is beyond words. Production and unemployment. So demand is collapsing. What does that result in? What does that lead to? Well, GDP is production. That is, the economy is shrinking on the way. And what that means is that unemployment is rising. And you can see this, the really kind of incredible jumps in the line, the red line, up and down. Up when it comes to unemployment, down when it comes to production. Wages and salaries. You see, wages were rising pretty fast before the crisis. But if you look at the standard of living graph, you will see that the blue line on your right-hand side graph is the average standard of living of the Eurozone, of the 19 member states of the Eurozone, in relation compared to the average the average European Union 28 member state level. So you can see that with the exception of Italy, in the early 2000s, all 4 southern European countries were below the average of the Eurozone. Greece was below, a little better than Portugal, and of course by now, again, it's right down at the bottom. So what has that done to fiscal consolidation, to austerity? Well, you can see that red line, that is the culprit, the big culprit, that's the deficit. And what you can see there is that we had a big deficit at the beginning of this crisis, 2009, which has been reduced quite fast. It is still a deficit, but it's gone up quite a lot. So one might think that, okay, so the recipe is working. You're being, the therapy is working. Well, it isn't, because if you look at the other graph, the right-hand one, that is public debt. And public debt is increasing on and on and on, going through the roof. So while austerity seems to be working in terms of the deficit, it is certainly not working in terms of the debt, simply because we keep borrowing, or they keep pushing loans down our throat in order to go to the next stage. Social indicators, just a little bit longer to look at the social indicators of what all these graphs mean. So, labor market indicators, social protection indicators, social inclusion indicators. And you can see that the unemployment is more than twice the size. It's 10% in the European Union on average. It's more than 26. Well, these are the 2014 figures. It's come down a little. It's come down to about 25% now. But you can see there's a big difference between the average of the European Union and what's happening in Greece. 26%. Long-term unemployment, 19%. 19% of the labor force, that is 1/5 almost of the labor force, have been out of work for more than a year. That means that they're losing their skills. You know, it becomes more and more difficult for these people to find a job. So, and if you go further down that column, you see that the young people up to 24 years of age who are neither in employment nor education or training is again 19%. So again, 1/5 of the young people up to 24 are simply drinking coffee in the cafeterias. There's nothing to do. They're not in employment, they're not in education, and so on. The social protection, the average there referred to expenditure, public and private expenditure, and that's been coming down. The unemployment, of course, is the benefit, the state benefit. The social inclusion indicators, you can see there that poverty and risk of poverty, people who are very close or who are already on the threshold of not having enough food to eat, to pay the bills and so on and so forth, has gone up from 29.4% to 36%, which is, again, a lot higher than the average in the European Union. The transfers from the budget, excluding pensions, don't make much of a difference. And the relative poverty in terms of income, again, has increased from 23 to 31%. So the situation overall in social terms is pretty bad. So what about privatization? We said that neoliberalism is key. Capitalism, in fact, and neoliberalism in particular, are very keen on privatizing things. Services, goods, assets, everything. Okay. Greece, however, is not new in the game. You have the figures for the 30-year period, 1977 to 2007, before the crisis, but it includes the turn to neoliberalism, the Thatcher years, the Reagan years, and the invitation of the privatization wave in Europe. And you can see that Greece is, the Czech Republic, Portugal, Hungary, is fifth down that list, with about 14% of GDP being the proceeds from privatization. So nothing new there. It's happened in the past throughout Europe, actually, not just in Greece. Now, but in Greece now we have a special fund set up by request is a polite way of putting it, of the creditors, the Hellenic Republic Asset Development Fund. They call it development fund, and but in fact it's about selling off. So strictly speaking, the objective of the fund is to manage valuable Greek assets and to maximize their value, which it will monetize, it will turn into money through privatizations and other means. The other means are not specified. 50 billion are expected to be made out of this by 2030, and of this 75% will go to the creditors and 25% for investment. As you will notice there, the board of directors consists of 5 members. The Greek parliament has no powers over this. It does give an opinion. It is called to give an opinion as to the suitability, but it cannot stop the appointment of the top guys there. The board has absolute authority on privatization decisions. The government cannot intervene. They cannot say, well, we disagree with this. Whatever the board decides, that happens. And of course, the CEO, the corporate executive officer, is fully responsible for the operation of the fund. It's like setting up a state within a state, a little island where, you know, things happen that you just observe, you just follow and cannot intervene. Any asset transferred to the fund is to be sold, developed, or liquidated. It cannot be returned to the state. And it's according, if you look up the site, the website of the fund, it says that what we have is the largest declared divestment program in the world. They're very proud about that. That's the port of Piraeus. I don't know how many people of you have been to Greece or to Piraeus or taken a boat. It's a pretty big port. 67% of the share capital of the port has been sold to China COSCO Shipping Corporation. The agreement will be ratified by the Parliament by June this year. The total value is expected to come up to 1.5 billion, and its concession rights until 2052. These are just 2 flagship privatizations which I'm putting up for you. There are many more. This is the second flagship privatization, really proud of that, our creditors. That is 14 regional airports throughout Greece, which are being bought by Fraport AG, Slento Limited Consortium. It's a German-based company, and this is expected to bring in an amount of about 1.4 billion over the next 40 years of the concession. It is also expected to create 1,500 new jobs in and around the airports. So what is the outlook for Greece? This is what's been happening. What is the outlook? Well, since the beginning of this year, we have had the first review of the latest program. Now, when they say review, what they mean is that they come in, that is representatives from the ESM right now, the European Stability Mechanism, the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF. That is what we call now, not the Troika, but the Quartet. So these guys come in, and they have long chats with the ministers, with the officers from various ministries about how things have been implemented in the past, since their last visit. Now, what's interesting is that it's not just a simple kind of, you have a list of things that you're supposed to do, so we ask you to please come forward and tell us what you've done from this list. Because what happens is they keep adding to the list. And this is what's happening right now. It's a kind of what I call carrot and stick game. The carrot that is dangling in front of your nose is the next tranche of the loan. But the stick is the fact that, well, you haven't done enough, so you need to do more. Well, in fact, this time around, it's interesting because the Greek economy has behaved very nicely, thank you very much. It's come up to the various figures that were included in the latest memorandum, the agreement. But now what we have is a new thing. The IMF, followed by Mr. Schäuble, are voicing the concern that in 2018 we will not have reached the targets of the program. That is, in 3 years' time we'll be behind. They do not deny that it's okay. I mean, you've done what you were supposed to do for this year and for last year, but they say, yes, but we don't think you're going to get there, which is why we want you to introduce more austerity measures in view of the fact that you are very unlikely to reach your target. So this is a new thing, and it's been going on. And of course, when that happens, this happened last year, when they were trying to close the second economic adjustment program. When that happened, what suffers is liquidity, because we are under capital controls regime. We have been under capital control regime since last year. So when that happens, people go to the banks and draw the money out, so deposits fall. They don't pay back their loans because they're scared they will not have enough money to live by. So the what happens in those conditions is a crisis of the banking system. And of course, by that time, the whole economy is really shaky. So this kind of carrot and stick game is not just a game, it has very serious economic and of course social, by extension, implications. What about debt restructuring? You see, all these figures, the targets, the deficit target that we mentioned earlier, are on the assumption that there is no restructuring of the debt, there is no relief, debt relief. And in fact, this quote is from the statement of the Eurogroup last year when the new agreement was reached, and it says in very clear terms there are not going to be any nominal haircuts. We cannot reduce the amount of the debt, the size of the debt. What we can do, they said, is to to reduce the possible longer grace and repayment periods, as well as probably reduce the interest rate. That has not happened. That is supposed to, talks about this will start after the review is finished, although the review is not being finished on the basis of the argumentation I just said. Okay, so what about the people? Okay, we know what the creditors are thinking. We know the game, we think we know the game because they keep coming up with new ideas. What about the people? What do they think? Well, this comes from Eurobarometer of last October, autumn 2015. The inner circle is the Greek sample. 97% of the people sampled, asked, replied that they think the economy is totally bad. 97% of the people. You can read in that figure the demoralization of a very large part of the Greek population. They simply giving up hope. The equivalent in the European Union is 57%, which is quite high. More than 50% of the people think that things are totally bad. And what are the biggest problems? Well, the biggest problems, the dark line, the black line, let's say, that's Greece. And you can see that it's unemployment, the biggest problem in the Greek mind. The economic situation, they're worried about the economic situation. They're worried about taxation. They're worried about the government debt. They're not so worried about immigration, even though we get thousands of people ending up on the shores of Greek islands. And you know, you can see that what is really troubling the people there in Greece and in the European Union on average. So, and I'm glad I'm keeping up to my 45 minutes. We're coming to the end of this not very cheerful narrative. Basically, I used a quote by the late Professor Jörg Hofschmidt. He wrote this in 2009. That was just before the crisis of the Eurozone crisis, that is. And at that time, Professor Hofschmidt said that as long as the underlying causes of the overaccumulation of financial assets is not addressed, the pressure will remain to organize ever higher profits for these assets. The pressure, therefore, for privatization opportunities may even become sharper than before. Well, that was prophetic. It was prophetically said because although it was at the beginning of the Eurozone crisis, which he was lucky enough not to live through, if you like to think of it that way, what has happened since that time is that finance has not been regulated. Finance rules okay, but the blame is put on the spendthrift governments. That does not mean that governments have no responsibility on the size of the public debt, but that is not the main problem. The main problem is what has been put forward as the living beyond one's means narrative. So it's not finance that has caused the crisis, it's the fact that you are spending too much. And if you're spending too much, what we need to do is to cut down and down and down forever. So we have gone full circle, and we come back to the neoliberal ideology, whereby the interventionist state, is seen as the fundamental problem. So we have to reduce what is spent on public services, on unemployment, so on and so forth. So basically, we need to shift back to fundamentals, to think again about the crisis, what caused it, what we need to do about it. We need to look for paths to alternatives. And that can only be done through a political process, where feasible alternatives become real possibilities. You see, in Greece, I'm a member of the Syriza party, and Syriza went through this period from about 5% of the election results in 2009 to more than 35% in 2015, last year. Since 2009, we have been very clearly against austerity. Last year, the Syriza government was made to sign an austerity agreement. So what you need there, what we need to infuse our analysis with is the political process. It's not enough to think about alternatives. You also need to think about the way to get there. How do you get there? And what we can offer as a lesson is that it's very, very hard. And even though Tsipras, in fact, the Prime Minister, keeps saying, I don't believe in this agreement, I signed it, but I don't believe in it, even though he's saying that, and ownership is supposed to be very important, so they don't like him for saying it, it's a fact of life that either you go bankrupt or you accept a new loan and then you get into this kind of process of austerity and so on. So what are the paths to alternatives? Well, we can do what we are doing here today, which is to think through critical analysis, to think things out. That is important, that is necessary. We also need to engage with oppositional movements. We also need to be activists. We need to be, and I think this is what is so great about this group, and this is the kind of path that I have pursued as a bank employee, being an analyst and an activist at the same time. You need to use your mind, but you also need to act. You see, in the absence of a European demos, of a European people, of a European of passive contestation, of legitimization, transnational solidarity is not going to happen from the elites. They're not going to say, okay guys, we understand your problem. We have to work for this on our own, and we have to recognize the injustice of those suffering from austerity, which is not just Greece, right? It's throughout Europe, more in some parts, less than others. And all this is summarized in the need for a struggle for emancipation. That is contesting the way in which boundaries are drawn, including the shaping of transnational political spaces such as the EU, the European Union. It is a huge challenge. I am not pretending that it is an easy one, especially with our own Greek experience of things, but it is the only way. There is no other way. Thank you.